Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is FTLS 130. We are here with a couple of the intrepid students who have decided to join us for the asynchronous recording. We have a lot to cover today. We're talking quite a bit about sort of some of the more advanced stages of the writing process where we've done some work writing and we've looked over, we've done a description paper and kind of worked on that. And then we want to start moving in some new directions from here. So what we're going to start talking about really is some ideas of cohesion. Let me share my screen here. I'll give you sort of the agenda so everybody can have an eye on it. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about cohesion. What does it mean? How do you build it? How do you look for it? And how do you look for places where maybe cohesion isn't happening? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about some organization strategies. And at this point, what I'm going to show you is some of the ways I'm likely to show you, or I will show you one of the projects that I've been working on that's sort of a hot mess right now. And then I'll show you kind of how I would go about addressing the messiness of it, because good writing will inherently be messy. In fact, if you start a difficult project and it's never messy at any point, chances are good your idea is not complicated enough for it to really have the teeth you want it to. It's okay if you have an idea and it really doesn't feel that way. I'm not trying to tell you that you should have some messiness, absolutely, and go create it for the sake of messiness. But I'm more trying to tell you that if you find in the paper process that you hit some messiness, it in fact doesn't mean you've done something wrong. In fact, it means quite the opposite, that the chances are good your ideas are complicated enough that now you're getting pushed up against a new wall of difficulty because you've gotten so good at something. You're now reaching the next level of difficulty. So a good way to think about it would be sort of if you were a diver and the first thing you have to learn is just how to dive, how to bounce off the springboard and then make your way into the water. Well, once you get really good at that, you may realize that backflips are really difficult. And it's because you've gotten good at one thing that it's now showing that there's the next step of development. So hitting that messiness in your writing isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong or even regressing. In fact, a lot of the struggles that we're going to see as writers come about directly as the result of growth. And so it's a weird way of kind of counterintuitive thinking that often we think when I'm getting better, things should get easier. But with something like writing, it's often the opposite, that when you get better, things get much more difficult because you're going to push into new advanced territory. And it's a good thing. So it's good to know, and it's good to not panic about that. It's also good to know that typically speaking, nobody is special when it comes to writing. Nobody is going to run into some problem that is so brand new that there's no help for it and no sort of experience out there to guide you. So it's sort of like I use a lot of analogies, as you're probably picking up. There's nobody who learns to drive and then suddenly has to wrestle with flying because their car keeps taking off into the air, right? So with writing, there's nothing that you're going to do in the process of learning to write where you're going to hit a struggle that's so brand new. Like, you're not going to run into a problem where you keep typing the names of mountains in the middle of sentences inadvertently, right? And you don't know how to fix it. There aren't problems like that. Every problem has happened to a lot of people over time. And so those are places where we can really work and grow together. We're going to talk then about paragraph and sentence level revision. This is a really important one because paragraph level revision will help you develop that sense of cohesion, and sentence level revision can be really difficult for a lot of people because it can feel tedious, and it can also feel like you're not sure that you're making things any better in the process. So a lot of times I can say revise the sentence for clarity, and you might not know, if you revise it and you work on it for 2 hours, how do you make it any better? So we'll work a little bit on that so that you can have a more confident approach to revising those sentences. We're also going to talk a little bit about quotation marks, and this is sort of taking a little bit of a shift, but as you're probably noticing, each week we're going to address some level of mechanics. And often when it comes to mechanics, what I find most fascinating, or my argument rather, would be, we think of things like commas, semicolons, quotation marks. We often think of them as being very basic and simple and sort of something you should already have in the bag. But the thing about it is it's actually a lot different than that. That to use punctuation in a way that's sophisticated and advanced and actually helps build meaning in your paper is so much more difficult than just knowing where to put a comma for appropriate grammar. It's actually a place where we can start building meaning, but we have to understand how it works so we can capitalize on that meaning and use it in that sophisticated way. Another way to say it is, I think we kind of learn what a tool is early, but we don't really learn how to use it until much later. And often many people never get to that point, but we're going to talk a little bit about that so we can all kind of push to that point. And I think if we focus on that, we can get there. And the first step in that is to recognize that working on something like mechanics is not basic, especially not at this level, that what we're looking for is something a little more advanced, or we're looking for a more complicated kind of engagement with it. And we'll talk about what that looks like. Then we're going to have some space for other questions. And then here, I'm going to, I've got a small announcement. Let me see if I can keep the font the same. What do you think, everybody? There is a writing and revision workshop tomorrow. And so I will be sending out information on it. It's going to be held on Zoom, and it will take place tomorrow from, let me go ahead and announce it. How's that? Does that work even better? So there's going to be a writing and revision workshop on Zoom tomorrow. So here's what we've got. Let me share my screen with this little flyer thing. This might even just be a draft of the flyer, but I'll send out a link to it. It's going to be tomorrow from 9:30 to 11 a.m. It's with Jamie Brown. She teaches here in the College of Professional Advancement, and her course, she typically teaches FDLS 130. So she's absolutely the perfect person to be teaching this, this workshop on writing and revision. So if you're watching this now, just pay attention for the announcement to go out on Canvas later today. If you are watching this later, hopefully you got that message. Know that this isn't a required workshop. It's not something that I'm going to make you all do, but I do think that it'll be beneficial. I'll be there in attendance, just to be present for it. I think it could be really useful for me to learn some ways to help everybody with revision. So just some encouragement there. If you're able to make it, pull up a pot of coffee and join us for an hour and a half. And if you need to leave early or join late, then by all means, you're welcome to do so as well. So that's where we are today. Let's start talking a little bit about this idea of cohesion. So I'm going to share my screen again, and let's talk a little bit about what cohesion really means and what kind of levels we're looking at. So here, my question to our class today, what is it? What do we mean when we say cohesion?
I think how well everything fits together and flows.
Okay, yep, fits together and flows. And so I think that's a really helpful piece, because when we think about fit and flow, right? Fit is about focus, and then flow is about sort of organization. And so those are two very useful terms for us to keep in mind here, which is different than just staying on topic, for example. So focus would be just, does everything fit in the same paper? Flow is, how exactly do we present the information to the reader in the order they need it? So here, if we think about fit and flow, I think that's a really useful sort of framework for us to kind of move forward. Does that sound okay with everybody? Ariana, do you have any thoughts on cohesion as well that you'd like to share before we go to the next step?
No, that's what I was thinking of as well.
Great. Great. So let's talk a little bit about fit and flow. So fit here, there are a lot of different ways that we can address information fitting into our paper. So everybody here set out on a paper. We talked about description, and Ariana, you did a description of, remind me your topic again. I think I'm slipping a little bit on it. What did you describe in your paper?
I described the mechanics of a scooter, of a manual.
I remember
scooter.
that. We talked about that yesterday. Great. So a scooter. And what about you, Rachel? What did you describe?
How to knit.
Perfect. Perfect. Right. So really difficult kind of topics. Both of them are far more complicated than I think we realize, especially knitting, I think is a really good example of that, where knitting is just really advanced knot work, right? And sort of, it's such an interesting kind of thing to think about in terms of pattern, and to be able to describe it in 2 pages had to have been extremely difficult. So we're thinking about fit here. What were your experiences, both of you, with fit? Did you find it difficult to make everything fit? If so, what did you find difficult, or did you find it really easy to stay within the boundaries of the paper?
It was hard for me to not want to run ahead. Like, I know the steps. And so I had to stop and go, okay, we have to take this part first, and then you have to add this part, and then you have to add that part, instead of trying to just run it all together at one time.
Great. Great. Ariana, how about you?
I think the most I had trouble was the flow of the paper, how like I wanted to describe the workings of it and how it would how they will all come together as one. I think that was my main issue when writing.
Great. And here's what's interesting about that. So Ariana, you found fit to not be that difficult, right? Which is an important piece. And flow actually sounds like it came too easily to you, Rachel. Do both of those sound like
I think so.
us in that direction? So Rachel, you were dealing with a process. So flow makes it's inherent to the topic, right? So if I were ever working with someone on flow and they were really struggling to just believe they could make a paper flow, just picking a topic that itself is inherently going to be chronological, basically. That flow, that means the chronology is already there. But that doesn't always work because we can't always describe processes in our papers, which is a little bit like what Ariana experienced, which is has this thing, this object where the process isn't as important, but the actual description is there. So the actual fit works easily because she has a scooter that's so inherently complex. Of course, if I asked Ariana to write a 10 pager, Ariana, do you think you'd have no problem getting to 10 pages talking about the scooter? Does that sound fair as well?
Yeah, that would be fair.
You're right. Right. And it may be the case too with Rachel's paper on knitting and with other students' papers on a lot of different topics. But what I'm trying to point out here is that there are certain things, couple of key takeaways here is when we're thinking about fit and flow, it's not that we ourselves are inherently incapable or struggling or something we've done leads us to this point. That in fact, quite a bit of what we're dealing with fit and flow has a lot to do with the topic and also the struggles we're going to run into with it. So for example, if you're thinking about knitting and you're doing a really complicated tight knit, I don't know exactly what the word is, and you have big gorilla hands like champion men do, right? You would have a hard time with just the needlework. So you would know from the beginning to look out for that and that this is something you're going to need to invest extra energy in to do it well. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means this is a problem that would obviously sort of surface at this point. So knowing that is helpful, and it's helpful in humbling in a lot of ways, because it's helpful knowing that, if you're struggling with staying on topic, choose a topic that is two things: complicated enough to write a lot about, and then also something of interest, because Ariana likes scooters, right? So and you like knitting, Rachel, and I like backpacking and tents and camping. So choosing a topic we care passionately about will make that easier. That holds true for everybody moving forward from every moment. So if you've ever wondered how somebody writes a book, it's because they care about the topic. People can't take on a project of that size and enormity without either great reward or great interest. And so we're not going to get a lot of great reward here in college. Nobody's going to, I mean, you could win an award, but you're not like going to make $1 million off a paper you write in FDLS 130. And if you do, you owe me half anyway. So it's already cut in half there. So the other part of it is that if we know these sort of struggles are likely to be inherent with the topic, then we can actually start leaning into that topic a little bit so we can build these skills. So if you think about going to the gym, I really don't like strength training. And so I love cardio. So if I'm doing cardio and I'm sticking with it, it's kind of like the person who, do you know the memes about don't skip leg day? Where somebody will take a photo of some huge muscly dude in line at a Walmart and his legs are look like broomsticks, right? But that's the idea here, is that if we know there's something we're struggling with, don't skip leg day, don't avoid it. So if you feel like flow is something that's difficult and you keep choosing topics that are easy to make flow, then that doesn't really help you, and it can set you up for bigger problems down the road. And similarly, also be humble about the fact that if you feel really strong about flow, go back over and see if you've chosen topics that really test the boundaries of how you're doing in terms of flow. And those are a little bit difficult. So let's pause for a minute. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of flow. I mentioned last week that flow is one of my least favorite words, and I've used it about a dozen times here. When we talk about flow, I want to talk to you a little bit about what flow means and how why I don't love it. And I think I've already mentioned that, but then also, what do we do then instead? Or how do we start to envision what a world looks like without flow in our vernacular? So the reason that I don't like flow is that it describes the product, not the process. And so in a classroom setting, flow is not very useful, even though we all know we can recognize a paper that flows. In the same way that if we went to a racetrack and watched drag races, I could point to you the fastest car, and that's the product, is this fast car. But that means it doesn't mean anything about my ability to build a fast car. So recognizing the quality of what I want doesn't recognize anything or tell me anything about the process to get there. So in terms of the classroom setting here, I want us to think about flow in a really specific way here. So flow is giving the reader the information they need in the order they need it. And so flow is giving the reader the information they need in the order they need it. But that raises a whole new question and a much bigger, more complicated question for each of us. And that is this: who is our audience? So if we're thinking about who is our audience and who is our reader, that's so difficult for a lot of us, because if pressed, most people in an FDLS 130 class or any class in college would immediately say that their professor is their reader. So they would say, oh yeah, my reader's Dr. Champion, right? And the truth is that that's not typically the way that we think about readership in the academic environment or our audience. That in fact, our audience are people who are interested in our topic already, that they are people who care about our topic and want to learn more about our topic. And our goal in a great paper is to add to that reader's understanding. So let's talk a little bit about what that maybe means if we're thinking about our specific area of interest. So let's look at one that's actually specific and concrete. So Rachel and Ariana, what if you were to look ahead 4 or 5 years, what career field do you think you would be interested in working in, even if it's not tied necessarily to your current major? If you're here just because you really love learning and you like the college environment, then I agree with you. That's how I ended up being Dr. Champion, was just sticking around as long as I could. And so it's okay if it's not tied to your time here at Mercer, but what are you hoping is sort of your career aspirations moving forward from here? And we'll use those as our example going forward. It's okay if you don't know as well.
My goal is to end up working for the Georgia Innocence Project.
Georgia Innocence Project. Great. Great. So let's use that just as an example. And then Ariana, chances are good by the end of this, you'll be working at the Georgia Innocence Project as well, because this is how this all starts, that in 30 years, Ariana is going to be the director of the Georgia Innocence Project, who is welcoming the new board of directors and Rachel to the board of the Innocence Project. And they'll say, one time we were sitting in Zoom with this frazzled old dude in Chicago, and he said, listen, here it is. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about this idea of social justice and prison reform. We're going to think about the idea of the sort of legal system. And so imagining that we are working on a project in that area, which, by the way, for each of you, if you're watching this here, or if you're watching it on EdPuzzle, take just a time out for a minute and let me tell you the best thing you can do right now for your chances of success here at Mercer is it doesn't matter what your career path is. What matters is that you have something you care passionately about learning about, and then in each class you learn more about it. Because in each class you're going to have an opportunity to learn something on your own volition. So for example, you'll get into psychology and they'll say, write a paper on this. And you'll say, all right, well, I'll just pick a topic that seems easy, which again is like skipping leg day. But what you could do is say, all right, I want to study the psychology of people who have been incarcerated for a long time. And that's a perfectly appropriate topic. Or if you get into sociology, you'll talk about ebbs and flows of cultures, and you'll say, I want to look at the ways that ideas of incarceration have changed over the last 50 years, which is a sociologically appropriate question. And basically what you can do is you can start leveraging the strength of your interest to make you more successful, because for most of you, if you chose a topic for description that is something you care about, chances are very strong you found it to be one of the more easy papers for you to write and more efficient. And you would find it to be more grammatically sound, typically speaking, and much more thorough and detailed, less straying from topics. So leverage the strength of your interest in every class from here on so that you can become an expert in every angle on your specific topic. That's the end of my soapbox, and I can tell you it's going to work. I can tell you 100% it will determine. If you tell me how interested somebody is in a topic, I can tell you their chances of graduation. But if you tell me what somebody wants to do when they grow up, I don't have a clue. It's 50-50, who knows? All right, so imagine we are in this environment now where we are writing papers, and we're writing papers on the topic of social justice and prison reform, incarceration, the legal system, penal system, right? And then we start thinking of our audience. Now, the initial response most people would give when I say, who's your audience? Say, for example, you decide you want to write, Rachel decides she wants to write a paper, and the topic is, in this case, Rachel's going to write a paper, and it's going to be prison reform and its efficacy. So here, she's going to basically examine different things that have been done in terms of prison reform. So it could be things like making for-profit prisons illegal, or deprivatizing, or the cashless bail, revoking that, any sort of prison reform element. She's going to look at that, which is great. It's a great topic. It's worth looking at. It's worth comparing. Now the question becomes, who's the audience? Our initial response would typically be to look at the people affected by the issue. So our initial thought, our knee-jerk or intuitive response would often be that our audience is composed of people in the prison system, or people who have loved ones in the prison system. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because we're looking at a population that typically is not studying the topic. Now, you probably have a higher likelihood of finding people who have been interested in the topic because they were directly impacted by it, but that doesn't decide for us who our audience is. Instead, our audience is composed of people who are researching the topic for whatever reason they came to it, which generally speaking will be professors. Largely, people who are publishing on topics like you're writing about will be professors, and I can promise you there's no topic that has not been addressed by some professor at some school somewhere. I can promise you that because I sit down at my computer and watch Netflix and write papers on stand-up comedy, and I can tell you people who have sat down to write about Disney movies from the 40s. I can tell you people who've written about headstones in Massachusetts and the materials they're made of. I can point you in the direction of people who have studied in Shakespeare every time a queen complains. There are people who are studying all sorts of different things. And so your audience is this group of people. So what I want you to do is, whenever you're sitting down to think about your audience, let's start identifying who our audience might be. And remember, it's not the people who you're writing about. It's generally people who are writing about the people you're writing about as well. So this sort of two-step. The advantage with this is that it starts putting you in a conversation with other people. So that idea of the academic conversation is really, really important. So here, the audience is other people studying your topic, not the people impacted by it per se. Does anybody know this term? Do you know that term, per se? Are you all familiar with this phrase here, per se?
Yes.
The term is useful just because it could be people impacted by it, but per se implies that they're studying it for their own reasons, but it's not because they're impacted by it, although it could be. So it's a useful term for that. Now, here's why it's important, is that academic writing is known as a conversation. So here, a conversation, that it's such a weird word for us to use, but here's how it kind of works. So I sit down, or I start writing and researching, and I do studies on stand-up comedy, and I study what it means to be a man, and I study what it means to be a man, and why stand-up comics always talk about all the things that men aren't allowed to talk about. So that's basically where I start. I love stand-up comedy, and I love watching, and I kept noticing that the things that The things that I was socially pressured away from talking about when I was younger and even older were the exact same topics that stand-up comics talk about. For example, Mike Birbiglia has a great special. If you haven't watched it yet, go watch it today. He talked about in his special, My Girlfriend's Boyfriend, how heartbroken he was getting dumped over and over again as a young man. That's not something that men typically can talk about. So if you go to coffee and your cousin and he sits down and says, listen, I'm just so heartbroken, you might be supportive, but you also know that you're in for a bummer day. Or if they go to football practice and say, I'm heartbroken, they're in for a rough day as well, right? So I started looking at this and thinking about stand-up comedy. Now, why does that apply to a conversation? Well, so Mercer starts hiring people, right? So they're looking for somebody to hire, and they say, all right, we need a person who can teach writing. And so they say, Jared, come on in. So they hire me, I come in, but then I'm here at Mercer and nobody here studies stand-up comedy but me, right? There might be some students of mine who have taken an interest eventually, but there are no other faculty members who are writing and publishing on stand-up comedy. So what I have to do is start having a conversation with other faculty members at other schools, because no school in America can hire all of us to work together to where we can have coffee together, share ideas, and build. So what we have then is this system where each university hires people who can cover certain topics, and they hire sort of a smattering of people from different topics. And then we have to publish and put our work out into the ether, and they read it, and then they respond to it publicly so other people can read it. So that's kind of like what the conversation is. Best way to think about academic writing, it's a little bit like that fight you've had on Facebook with people you've never met. And so somebody comes in and they say their point, and then Tina from Seattle chimes in, and then you chime into Tina, and then Tom from Tacoma chimes in, and then this conversation starts happening where everybody who joins later can read where the conversation's been and then add their voice. There's some pretty important differences. It's not angry, it's not aggressive, or not meant to be, but it's meant to be public in this way, and it's meant to identify exactly how you're engaging. Other way to think about this is, we have you cite things when you bring in outside sources. And on Facebook, I'm sorry, it's Facebook is my reference point here. I know that dates me a little bit, but on Facebook, when you can put like you're responding to somebody and it highlights and you say their name and say, Jared, here's what I'm responding to, because you're in a thread of 50 different people and you want to make sure Jared hears the thing you've got to say, because that's where Jared's wrong. That's what a citation is. It's you saying, this is what I'm responding to, and here's what I'm adjusting and adding to. And so it's about this conversation. A lot of times we're told that citation is about giving credit, and it's kind of that, but actually at this level, what we want you to think of is you absolutely want to cite things, but you want to cite it so we can understand where you're pitching in your comment and where it fits into the conversation and how you're building and moving that forward. A lot of things going on there. I know that's it's sort of chaos, but it's also a lot of good stuff there, hopefully. But I want you to think about this idea of your audience specifically because it will help you narrow the stuff you need. What do you need to put into your paper and what can you leave out? We talked last week about the idea of interest and how papers don't have to be interesting, for example, because if your reader really wants to know what you have to say, they're going to read it no matter what. It still needs to be presented clearly and concisely, but this is it's an important thing to kind of leave that baggage at the door. You don't have to be interesting. There's nothing you can do in your paper that will be interesting if the person isn't already interesting. You have no control over your readers. All you have control over is how you present your information to them. So let's take a moment here and let's talk a little bit about one of my favorite models for how we think about ourselves. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a stock photo because I think this is going to be a lot of fun to kind of think about this. All right. When we're thinking about ourselves as writers, what I want you to think about yourself as is an attorney. And so think of yourself as an attorney, and you sit down and your job is to present information to an audience and a jury. Now that jury wants you to be right. That's a really important piece. We're also going to be presenting what we call an argument. And an argument is not the same thing that we have in our daily lives. I had an argument the other day with Verizon, and everybody probably has said that sentence at some point in their lives. It could be Verizon, could be Xfinity, could be Comcast. I don't know who it is, but we've all had that argument. And an argument in that case is not what we're talking about. in that case, those arguments they're upsetting. Both people get heated, that there's this sort of tension and this wanting to win. And I don't know what it means to win with Comcast. I think it just means that your internet works for 20 more minutes than normal. But there's this desire to be the victor. In academic writing, that's not what an argument means. An argument is a supported interpretation. And so it's your job to, let me write this again. An argument, okay, is a supported interpretation. So what you're doing is you're looking at all the evidence and you are pulling out your interpretation. In fact, your argument when you wrote a description paper was an argument, because you're saying, I'm looking at all this evidence of the process of knitting. I'm looking at all this evidence of the construction of a scooter. And when I walk away from that, this is what I think is important for you to notice about these steps. Your argument is implicit in that you're saying, these are the things you need to know. So your interpretation is, I've looked at all this evidence and I've pulled out what you need to know. So I've simplified it in a way. It may not feel like an argument in the way that you're thinking of it, because you may be thinking of an argument as having victors and losers and winners and choosing a side. That's another one, by the way, that I don't like, because it's not a side. We're all looking to get better and understand something more. Let me give you a good example and kind of bring it back full circle. Rachel said she's working in, really interested in prison reform. Well, most people who are interested in criminal justice are not, they don't mean ill. There are very few people, there may be some, who really just think, you know what, these people aren't valuable. They're not good. We just give up on them, right? There's very little of that, but there's a lot more people who are in this sort of spectrum that are saying, I don't know what to do, or I believe that this is the answer and it's more severe. Or you might have some people who say, I believe this is the answer and it's less, it's more graceful, right? Or it's more punitive, or it's more restorative, or this method works. But the big takeaway is that most of the time, when we're talking about an academic argument, we're all on the same team or want the same thing in the end. Most people in criminal justice want victims to feel like they've received justice. Most people want people to be reformed, if at all possible, to pay penance or pay their debt to society, but also walk away better than they were before. Nobody wants the outcomes that happen typically with prison, which is repeat offenses, that you may come out more violent. That's not what people want most of the time. And it's hard to see in a polarized America. Most people kind of want the same thing, right? Nobody wants, kind of the takeaway here is everybody is looking at the same problem and they ultimately want a solution to it. They may disagree dearly on what that solution is. And maybe some people are looking at evidence not as well as you, or not the right evidence. We may disagree on that. The best example of this, by the way, there was during it must have been 2008, I believe, John McCain ran against Barack Obama for president. And there was a town hall, and full disclosure, I didn't vote for McCain. I voted for Obama, so the politics don't matter, but I want you to know that, because I think it'll help inform kind of my view of why I think this was important. And someone in the town hall asked John McCain, said something like, he's not even an American. He's been lying to us about his birth and his faith, right? And John McCain took away the microphone and said, what I think matters to our conversation here. He said, I won't let you say that. It's not true. Barack Obama is a good man with whom I disagree with on some fundamental issues. And that's important, because we lose sight of that in this era now, when we all think of argument as screaming at strangers while we're sitting on the toilet typing a mean comment on YouTube, right? That's what we think argument is. But the truth is, argument is a lot more like what John McCain described, where you have two people who want what's best for America and disagree about what that path is, but ultimately they both want the same thing. In academic writing, that's really what we're looking at. So everybody is looking to build something collectively together, and your argument can often be that sort of collective building. So if you think about your description, for example, of knitting, Rachel, that is contributing, because anybody who's interested in learning about knitting can read that and build. And then say, for example, if Ariana tries it and then she says, look, I tried this and I learned to knit some things, but there are a couple of steps we could make better if we did something different. Well, that's an argument, right? Because you're saying I could make this better in some little way by revising a little bit of what Rachel said, but overall, here are the strengths of what she said, and here's the next thing. And then I could chime in and say, I think this is great, but I think what they missed out on is that there's a tool, they didn't talk enough about the knitting needles, and I think these work better for this reason. And then we're moving forward. Collectively, we're moving forward. So I want you to think about argument in that way, and it's really going to help you build that cohesion in your paper, specifically because anytime you can think about your audience before yourself, it will make your work much tighter because you were only thinking of what you need. So I want to pause for a minute and kind of reflect on this just a moment. About 20 minutes ago, when Rachel shared what it was like writing the paper specifically about knitting, it sort of hit the nail on the head. What Rachel said was, I kept skipping ahead and thinking, oh, I need this and I need that, and I kept getting ahead of myself. And that's perfect for what we're describing, because what you're saying is, I'm so familiar with this that I had to think like a new person, because I would then recognize I was skipping stuff somebody that was new to the hobby would have needed. That's really important for building that cohesion, is to think about your audience and think about what they know and what they don't know. The last thing I'll say on this in terms of cohesion is I want you to think about your audience a little bit like a friend of yours who goes to see the same movie as you, but at a different showing. And so they go to the movie theater in the afternoon for a matinee, you go later that night, and then you go have coffee the next day. And your friend says, my favorite thing was how that character was really kind. And you say, I thought they were really mean. So you both have a disagreement. You both like the movie, but you disagreed on something. And then you don't have to tell them the plot of the whole movie. You just jump to the scenes with evidence that are showing how you reach this supported interpretation of the film. And so it really helps narrow that, but it also sets the parameters on it, because you can't then start talking about a whole different movie or a magazine you read or something. You're setting the sort of guardrails on that. Do I have questions about this idea of cohesion before we move on to some other new stuff? Cool. Can you tell I'm over caffeinated, everybody? Maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit. Okay. So here, let's talk about some organization strategies here. So organization strategies, we're going to kind of buzz through these relatively quickly, because we only have about 20 minutes left, give or take. And I want to make sure, maybe 15. Did I say, yeah, 15 minutes or so. So some organization strategies here that I think everybody should try. I think what you should try here is describing the paper to a friend or a recording. So anytime you're writing a paper, it could be your argument, it could be your description. We're going to write a comparison and contrast. Try recording yourself just talking about it. And pay attention when you watch that recording back. Look for places where you have to back up. Notice how many times I have to stop and I say, all right, pause on this. Let's think about this, or let me go back to this thing. Anytime you say that, that's a signal that the organization could be polished up so that you could organize it a little better. But just try to get draw a bead on what it looks like and where the structure is currently, and then pay attention to the places where you break free of that. Another thing here is outline after the draft. And outlining after the draft is absolutely critical. It's a really interesting step. I don't love outlining before you start writing your paper all the time. Some people it works really well. I think that it can have its own special complications, especially when you get more advanced in your writing process. But what I can also say here, sorry, my phone is buzzing and making me crazy here. What I can also say here is, if you take your paper and look over it and write an outline of where you've gone, it can give you a really good map of where you should go and how you can get from one place to the other. So it'll give you a sense of what you've written, so you can kind of see it from a different angle. So in a sense, you're kind of seeing the forest through the trees. So take whatever draft you have. This is a great week to do it, because we have the first draft of our second small paper assignment due on Friday, Tuesday, but you can start then revising that draft and taking a look at it. I think that one works really well too. And the other thing that I would say is start doing some Venn diagramming of paragraph pairs. And what I mean by this is anytime you're writing and you start putting together two paragraphs, start looking at ways that you could diagram them to see where they're similar and where they're different. And what that can help with is helping you to see that it's a little bit like a monkey in the trees, right? Where you want to grab onto the next branch before you let go of the one you were swinging from. And so if you do a Venn diagram with your paragraphs, where you say, these are two paragraphs, let me make sure that it's clear how they connect, you can make sure that you're moving your reader through topic by topic and showing those connections. What's also helpful here is anytime you need to shift gears abruptly. So if you're in a paper and you have to go from topic A, B, C, and now you're going to jump over to LMN, then you can just say on a related but distant topic, you can introduce that in your transition to say, get ready, we're going in a different direction pretty abruptly. And that will prep your reader, because those transitions can tell the reader how to prepare for the paragraph they're about to read. Doing a Venn diagram can help as well. I'm going to pull up here a little bit of my own work, and I want to show you all a little bit of this messiness that I'm describing. So what I'm working with is a paper. It's on mental health and stand-up comedy. There's a comedian named Patton Oswalt. You may or may not know him. He's had some rough work early in his life where he said some things you might read about here that I'm not super proud that he said. And then he's got some really great stuff later on. So if you're into true crime, for example, his wife, she passed away in the middle of a project that researched the Golden State Killer. And so she was working on this project, was like 90% of the way through. He woke up in bed one day and she had passed away in the night next to him. And so he finished up the project for her. Police read the book and used the information from the book to then capture this killer from the 70s who had been on the lam for 50 years. And so it's this really incredible story. But he's also the voice of Ratatouille. He's a comedian you might have known. But I'm working on a paper that addresses him talking about mental health. So that's what you're going to see here. And I want to highlight for you some of the ways that the things that I'm talking about kind of come into play. So here's the chapter here. It's a lot of stuff kind of going through, but we're talking a little bit about this idea of the Venn diagrams. This is the very first introduction, or the start of the introduction. And I'm talking a little bit about this. He did this really hilarious bit that you all should check out, where he talked about the famous bowls at KFC when they came out. This was, I think, in 2007, and it was kind of his breakthrough bit where he described the famous bowls as being a failure pile and a sadness bowl. And then he kind of starts talking about that. But notice that when I'm going from topic to topic here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get from here is where his breakthrough moment was. And then I need to explain a little bit about where he came from. So I just have to prep the reader to say we're going back in time. So even before this happened, this is what I'm looking at. And that's the type of thing that we're looking for here is, can you tell the reader where their brain should shift or where they go? So much of flow is not necessarily organizing your paper, although that's a big piece of it. But a lot of flow is just telling the reader what to expect next so that their brains can be prepared for what follows. Keep in mind here, 100% of the papers you write, you're the expert. It may not feel that way. You may not feel confident in that way just yet, but you're the person that people are turning to at this point to learn more about your topic for whatever reason they've shown up. So you're the expert. So it's your job to guide us and prep us for what's about to come. Think about this a little bit like when somebody tells you to sit down before bad news, right? So they tell you to sit down. And even if you don't sit down, mentally, your brain is still getting ready for the bad news, right? You're still saying, all right, here's what I know this is coming. So mentally you can be prepared. Well, on a micro level, that's what a transition does for your readers, that they're saying, all right, I'm getting ready now to go back in time and talk about evidence that happened earlier. Or if we go back to the paper that I'm sort of working on here, we might see here, let me see if I have a good example here. See, I want you to notice how messy this is, everybody. Look how many of these aren't even finished, right? So I've got a paragraph here that's obviously not going anywhere. I've got ellipses here telling me that I need to go back and visit. So we've got this sort of messiness. It's basically my way of saying that it happens with each of us. But here's a good example. So when we look at this paragraph, you don't even have to know what it necessarily means. But I talk here about his growing popularity and that he's 30 years, his growth as a comedian has happened over 30 years. And so then I have here this quote that talks about this idea of hegemonic masculinity. You may not know what that means. It doesn't necessarily matter. But notice here that when I introduce this quote, it's about the same thing. It's about this hegemonic masculinity. And it's this word, however, that's my transition, because it preps the reader to know that I'm shifting the logic. It tells them I'm going in a different direction than what they just read. And so what I would encourage you to do is when you're reading each of your paragraphs, when you're starting to think about the revision of those paragraphs, ask yourself, have I told the reader the logic, the shift that we're making, or the way that the logic's going to go? For example, what you might say if you're working on a step-by-step paper, like the paper that deals with steps in knitting, you might say the next step is, instead of just saying next or second or third, you might say something like the next step is a little more difficult but doable if you follow this step, because then they're saying, all right, I know I'm going to have to do with something a little bit more complicated, but this is how I'm ready for this information, or they're sort of gearing up in that way. You might also say this next step is easy, but takes a long time. This one is easy if you choose the right materials, right? Or this one is difficult for everybody except seasoned pros. So then if I'm brand new, I know, all right, this is going to be hard for me, but eventually it'll get easier. For Ariana's work on the scooter, you might say something like, this is something that is new to scooters this year, or this is something that is a new development, or this has been around forever. This is a problem we've seen. But if you prep the reader for what they're going to see with your transition, instead of just saying first, next, then however, you're going to be in great shape. Let me pause on that for a minute, and then I'm going to I want to dig a little deeper onto it. The key here with your transitions is that those transitions, you want them to do more work than just introducing a new paragraph. So words like first, next, second, those aren't good transitions because we already know you're starting your next paragraph based on the very nature of the fact that you've hit indent before the paragraph. So telling the reader next is sort of repetitive because we already know you're moving on to the next piece based on the fact that you started a new paragraph. However, what we also are doing is we're only talking about the structure of the paper, and we've ignored the logic of where we're going. The logic is what we want to transition, not the paper itself. So what I mean by that is you want to tell the reader what the topic is and how it relates to the previous topic. That's really what we're kind of getting at with this one as well. Now let's take a peek here at I lost my little agenda here. Let me pull that up real quick. And then I will share here and we'll kind of get this thing wrapped up as quickly as possible. So here, paragraph level revision, the takeaway from this section of it is read like an audience member. Oh, my finger's not working. Okay, our new paragraph, not introduction. How does that sound? So the idea here is when you transition, don't think of just transitioning that there's a new paragraph. Instead, what I want you to do is remember to transition telling us why you decided to have this paragraph where it is. If you do that, we're in good shape, even if that transition is abrupt. Now let's take just a couple minutes here. I know that we're really running low on time, but I want to show you here. This is again the Towson Writing Center. Let's talk a little bit about the idea of the quotation marks. And so quotation marks have a very specific sort of pair of uses. One of the uses here is that it's for titles of specifically articles, so something that is within something else. So for example, if it's an article in a newspaper, if it is a chapter in a book, if it is a song in an album, it would go in quotation marks. So that's what we're getting here with the sort of titles of songs. This is why it's really one of my favorites. This is often why it's hilarious when people misuse it. And so here, to enclose words used ironically or where the term so-called could be inserted. And so, for example, sometimes I'll pass a restaurant and they will say, the best Italian food in Chicago, right? And they'll put that phrase, their motto, in quotation marks, but it's hilarious because it's not a quotation and it's indicating that they're being sarcastic. And so I think that's really hilarious. So anytime you see this, pay attention. There's a sign if you've ever been up to North Georgia, say you went up to Ellijay to go apple picking or something of the sort, or Hiawassee to go hiking, you'll see this big sign and it'll say land for sale. And in quotation marks, it'll say, make me an offer I can't refuse. And so what that means is what they're trying to say is they're trying to make a reference to The Godfather or say, make me an offer. But what they're actually saying is sarcastic. They're saying, make me an offer I can't refuse, or like, I'm going to refuse only. And so it's a pretty hilarious one there as well. This part here is where it's most commonly used, is you put quotations around what somebody said exactly. So if you're bringing into your paper the verbatim words of someone else, you put them in quotation marks to indicate to your reader that's because that's what they said. That's what it typically would indicate. And so here, he said that I had won the lottery. The difference in these two sentences is the first is indicating that this person, he is who won the lottery. And so putting the quotation marks, if he said I had won the lottery, he's saying the speaker won the lottery, because he's saying exactly, this man said, quote, I won the lottery. But if he says I won the lottery this way without quotation marks, it means this person told another person they won the lottery. It's the same sentence. Remember, I said that when we're thinking about punctuation and mechanics, it shapes meaning. It really does shape meaning. And this is a great example of how it changes meaning for better or worse. So here, this one is also a really interesting one. Let's skip this one for now, but basically if you need quotation marks twice in the same setting. So for example, here, the song Amazing Grace would go in quotation marks, and then the sentence is a direct quote. So it would also go in quotation marks. There's a way to work with that. This is a little more rare right now, but eventually you'll need this, especially if you're writing papers about novels, for example, that comes in really handy. Or if you're writing up interviews, those are pretty typical and commonly used in those settings. So what I would encourage you to do, let's take a look back here. I want to walk you through how I got to this page so you can all kind of take a look. If you'll remember last week, what I mentioned is that you can go to Google Towson Writing Center exercises. And then from there, you go to this page here. It looks like an 80s MySpace page. An 80s MySpace page. Can you believe I said that? Like we had the internet then. But you can kind of hear the modem dialing up when you see this page. I think that part's a much more accurate, non-anachronistic way of saying it. And then here, when you click on punctuation, it'll bring you here, and then quotation marks are right here, and that'll give you the rules. But once you've finished with this one, I would also encourage you read this. It won't take you more than 10 or 15 minutes. Go over to exercises here, click on punctuation, and then go down to punctuation marks. And then here with direct quotes works really nicely. And then also italics and quotation marks with titles. That one will save you a lot of points in your time here at Mercer as you're trying to figure out how to put quotation marks around titles. Because it's a place a lot of people really struggle with. But quotation marks with the right titles as opposed to italics, that's a really important one. And maybe we'll visit that next week. Now, before we wrap up here, do we have any questions for the good of the order? Meaning, do we have any questions from Rachel or Ariana? If we have questions, I'll stick around for those after we're finished the recording. But let's take a look at that. Any thoughts or questions so far?
No.
All right. Well, great. Thank you, everybody. Let me just remind everyone, if you are having any difficulty, I encourage you to reach out to me so that we can schedule a time to meet on Zoom. I'm happy to do so. If you're doing well and then you still think that you'd like to talk or you need anything, feel free to let me know, specifically because office hours can be a good time for us to set some goals for you, even if you're doing really well. I like to remind people that Michael Jordan had a coach at the top of his game. Serena Williams had a coach at the top of her game. You've got Tiger Woods had a coach at the top of his game. That it's okay if you feel like you're doing great and you just want to figure out some new strategies, that's fine as well. We're going to go ahead and stop the recording here. If you're watching this on Ed Puzzle, I hope you're doing well. Let me know if you have any questions. And I think that covers it for now. Let me pause, stick around, and I'll say goodbye to you two in just a moment. Thanks, everybody.